my presentation is going to address the contemporary haunting and reenactments of European and American settler colonialism on the Southern and Central California frontier, specifically, as you said, Greg, in the city of Santa Barbara. And this is an example of the type of image you would see in Santa Barbara, the red tiled roofs and the kind of off-white adobe architecture that's reflected in the buildings. And this is a view facing east. This is another iconic image of Santa Barbara's mission. And I'll speak further about the mission in my presentation. So the area was, of course, initially settled by the indigenous groups for at least 11,000 years before the arrival of Spanish conquistadors. And for those of you who are not familiar with Santa Barbara, it's about 1.5 hours north of Los Angeles and 4.5 hours south of San Francisco by car. Population is about 92,000. So today I'd like to talk about the Santa Barbara County Courthouse murals by the early to mid 20th century artist named Daniel Sayer Groesbeck. And I'd like to investigate the idea of sexuality as settler colonial history through these murals. How can queer and feminist and post-colonial theory be used to analyze the murals' scenarios of encounter between the Spanish and New World Chumash in 1542, as well as Groesbeck's representation of the Spanish missionary period between 1769 and 1821. So you can see from this image here that Groesbeck's paintings serve as the prominent backdrop to contemporary marriage ceremonies in the courthouse today. And this is kind of what I'm calling a geospatial construction of race and sexuality in the Renaissance, which informs my exploration of these murals as erotic signifiers of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant fantasy projections of a socially stable Santa Barbara onto global and indigenous bodies. And we can trace Groesbeck's scenic representations back to the US Progressive era's restaging of Santa Barbara as a wealthy resort town after the devastating 1925 earthquake, which basically leveled downtown and was the moment at which these city planners repurposed the city as the new Spain. And they used seed money from the Carnegie Foundation after the earthquake as a kind of way to take control of the reconstruction apparatus after the earthquake of 1925. So that being said, through my analysis of how these murals perform, I'm arguing that present day wedding ceremonies, such as the one you're looking at here, enacted in front of Groesbeck's murals, are polymorphously dramatic encounters between the newlywed and the nearly dead, which is a kind of ironic statement about Santa Barbara's culture. It's a place where often people go to get married because it is a beautiful Mediterranean, it's called the American Riviera, and it's also a place where very wealthy people retire. And so I'm playing off of that. Santa Barbara's gentrified stage contextualizes these murals as the scenic backdrop for the city's Spanish colonial fantasy production. And the courthouse mural room here provides an immersive prop for its urban theater of historical illusion and Santa Barbara's present dreamland, in which bodies reenact imagined scenarios of discovery. So these scenarios that I'm talking about are, as performance studies scholar Diana Taylor describes, transport us as expedition leaders, if you will, or newspaper readers, from here to an exotic there. And these transfers translate the others' systems of communication into one we claim to understand, and transforms past enactments, earlier discovery scenarios, into future outcomes, usually the inevitable loss of native lands. And in doing so, the scenario simultaneously constructs this wild object and the viewing subject, producing a we and an our as it produces a them. And as viewers of Grossbeck's murals today, we as viewing subjects are induced to other the bodies depicted in this scene and transported through this historical past through Grossbeck's mural. Visitors and tourists alike come to this room as a public venue to understand how California and the US was formed. And this is a kind of theater architecture that I'm talking about. This ornately decorated mural room contains, as you can see, bench seating, dramatic lighting. It really is this an elevated platform, as well, as you can see, which provide the setting for marriage ceremonies as I describe them, which I'm talking about them in terms of being a real-time participation in Santa Barbara's self-styled Spanish colonial spectacle. And as couples tie the knot within the artist's cartoonish rendering of European conquest and colonization, they affirm and normalize a US narrative of colonization and inevitable indigenous loss. So then I'm drawing on post-colonial and queer methodologies to queer Santa Barbara's courthouse murals, which I argue, again, are civic propaganda for US neo-colonial empire in Santa Barbara. And this idea of this manufactured civic identity in the 1920s enabled business executives working in concert with government agencies to rebrand Santa Barbara through Spanish colonial myths designed to educate the local population on their history while appealing to wealthy tourist class. So as a queer reading, I want to open up Grossbeck's subjects to a resignification process to kind of introduce an alternative queer feminist discourse surrounding his aesthetic bodies in relation to live marital bodies performing within the same space. Here's another image, and you can see the backdrop of the wedding ceremony here. So these vanquished others, quote unquote, such as Chumash men and women, signify the realities of polymorphous, non-heteronormative, gender non-binary erotic lives. And in my historiographic writing and analysis of global bodies as mapped subjects here, I interpret Grossbeck's asexual representation of others as an atlas of compulsory, puritanical, and heteronormative societal demands of the 1920s, in which the US imperialist framing of such bodies denied interracial coupling and non-heteronormative sexual practices. So in the wake of this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant rebranding of Santa Barbara as a tourist destination for families after the 1925 earthquake, narratives of the city's colonial past were subject to a landed gentry elite's fearful reaction to urban disorder. So adjacent to the Spanish Chumash first contact scene, which I'll show you next, reveals Grossbeck's visual mapping of the Spanish mission period. Here the artist renders the construction of Santa Barbara's imposing mission tower covered in scaffolding, around which brawny workers flex their burly forearms, and sinewy, serene natives relax under the supervision of the friar. And so Junipero Serra this is an image of the construction of the mission. And this figure of Junipero Serra is represented by this friar here. And of course, Serra, as Greg has written about, is credited with the conversion of the Chumash in Santa Barbara. He was a self-flagellating Franciscan friar who combined medieval corporal torture, such as whipping, to discipline himself and indigenous peoples. And this is an element that I argue that Grossbeck's conversion narrative conveniently omits as part of his staging of the city's Arcadian past. And so in mapping life as a kind of peaceful coexistence between the quote, an unenlightened Chumash and Spanish in a California fantasy heritage, Grossbeck reinscribes a deeply condescending reality of presumptions of native intelligence and sexuality. There's a quote by a scholar: in view of admittedly unscientific opinions on the native endowment of the various races and levels of society in early modern Europe, it is not surprising to find that many Spaniards, although by no means all, regarded the Indians of the Americas, or at least the commoners among them, as limited in their mental capacity. So additionally, despite the fact that these Franciscan narratives of contact with Chumash indicate polygamy among chiefs, premarital and extramarital coitus among commoners, as well as the existence of two-spirit gender roles, Grosbeck's murals, and Santa Barbara's self-mythologization as a Spanish colonial Disneyland persistently omits these aspects of Chumash culture in its dominant cultural mapping and staging of a fantasy heritage narrative. And regarding indigenous sexuality, author Brian McCormack writes that Spanish explorers and missionaries to California also documented the pursuit of intimacy and sexual pleasure within several native of the region, and were not confined to the rigid heterosexual procreative marriage form sanctioned by Roman Catholicism. And the native sexual and the gender and sexual forms contained within it provided evidence of native savagery and debasement and the need for conquest and salvation. And this is a closer image of Junipero Serra's oversight and this kind of Arcadian past representation of the relations between the indigenous and the Spanish colonial friars. And in this depiction of the Chumash man, you see on the left on all fours here, Grosbeck's mural, or what I'm arguing is an ideological map, underscores common stereotypical tropes that in their pagan state, the Indians entered into no contracts marriage and mated after the fashion of animals. And while monogamy was the norm, sexual activity varied among the Chumash, who widely accepted premarital and extramarital sex. And additionally, according to one scholar, the Chumash had Burdash, who appeared to Europeans as effeminate men dressed as women. The Spanish called them Hoyas, a term that may have been derisive in Spanish culture, but inadvertently conveyed the regard with which such men were held in Chumash culture. And we cannot ignore the history of the West's objectified bodies in visual images and maps as evidence in a contemporary context, particularly in this type of art, which I'm showing you, that purports to illustrate indigenous peoples in California's history. So I'm trying to confront Santa Barbara's public art historical presentation of official colonial accounts, which Grosbeck diligently transcribes in his fetishistic mural room painting. And we can analyze this artistic theatrical setting as a stage that allows for performative reenactments of the present, including thousands of I do's and metaphorical I don'ts. The painted object here functions as a prosthetic device, allowing contemporary couples to slip into time. My question is, to whose time do they relate? Do mural room visitors imagine themselves as part of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo's Spanish fleet executing the supposed promise of a new world? Or do they imagine themselves as part of an indigenous past? And how can a romantic neo-colonial Spanish history painting contained within this county courthouse, this government building, presumed to transmit an indigenous culture's embodied repertoire, leaving no trace of that particular culture's creative authorship? So this is serving as the backdrop to thousands of local weddings annually. And the mural room itself, because of its rental, the fact that it's an event rental facility, generates substantial revenue for the Santa Barbara County government. There's even a special events coordinator who schedules it for highly orchestrated wedding events where these vows are exchanged, and culturally specific affiliations such as family, religion, and class forms the social frameworks of memory. This artwork itself, I'm arguing, is silently narrating each wedding. And the mural room itself functions as a polytemporal mental space where imagined futures of wedded bliss converge with staged memories of violent empire. Some larger view of this particular wall. In addition to intervening in Dan Sayer-Grossbeck's mural room depictions by demonstrating how the omitted sexual narrative provides a platform for discourse surrounding missionary perceptions of indigenous as unintelligent and animalistic, I provide evidence for the historically archived cross-dressing Berdache, as well as extramarital and premarital intercourse among Chumash. So furthermore, not only does Grossbeck depict an asexual history, he also omits women from Santa Barbara's historical visual repertoire. And in his sycophantic desire to please his mural room commissioners, he neglected to show the sadistic and masochistic practices of Friar Junipero Serra, whom the city of Santa Barbara protects as a patriarchal Catholic torturer. Such fear of quote unquote biting the hand that feeds dovetails with how Santa Barbara chooses to construct its mythical past and perpetuate its fantasy heritage into the present. And so in conclusion, through this engagement with the site and the space of the courthouse mural room, I hope to re-signify it as an expansive sexual site in which couples wed themselves to the historical past and present. And here, the newlywed becomes the ineluctable co-star of Santa Barbara's Spanish colonial theater that I argue betroths them to divergent historical alternatives to hetero and homonormative coupling under the law. So reading Grossbeck's murals against the evidence of rape and genocide of the Chumash, in addition to Franciscan narratives describing polygamy among Chumash chiefs, premarital and extramarital coitus among commoners, I want to ironize the juxtaposition of hetero and homonormative wedding ceremonies in a courthouse chamber haunted floor to ceiling by sexual histories of violence and non-monogamous relationships. While these murals obscure past sexual histories, they also perform in the present by reaffirming patriarchal domination and white supremacy. So in this feminist historiographic queering of Grossbeck's paintings, I perform my own desire for legibility of Santa Barbara's queer, homoerotic, and feminist artistic expression, while critiquing the city's colonial narrative of domination and control. And the city's denial of its polymorphous sexual subjectivities, past and present, perpetuates the fabrication of Santa Barbara's structurally racist, sexist, and classist cultural production. And on that note, this is an image of quote unquote vandals who attacked the mission at Santa Barbara with red paint. This happens from time to time in Santa Barbara. And you can see the, priest here. And frequently as well, the head of the statue of Junipero Serra will be removed, and in this case covered with red paint. So that's all I have. Thank you so much.